everyone. Welcome to a new episode of One Vision, the Fintech Fuse. This is Theo, your host for the episode. We are in for a special treat today. Joining us on the show today is Keith Grossman, President and Enterprise at MoonPay, also the former president of Time Magazine and the global CRO of Bloomberg. Welcome to the show, Keith. Super excited for our conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So let's start with one of the most recent announcements. Starting off the positive note is the new partnership between MoonPay and PayPal, which, according to the press release, will enable all of MoonPay users in the US to purchase crypto with PayPal using wallet transfers, bank transfers, and debit card transactions. Now, for those who are listening in and not familiar, can you tell us a little bit more? How exactly is this going to work, and why is that a big deal for the future of money?
Sure. So before I go into this, I will say two things. One is thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. Every time you and I chat, it's been fun. Two, I'm actually petrified when you start the conversation off on, let's start with a positive note. So before I answer any questions, I want to know, like, is there a big matzo ball coming on the negative note? Because I'm like, wow, we're starting off on this because now all of a sudden I'm going to be hit this way. So I'm preparing myself for the negative, but hopefully if the negative never comes, I'm happy that we're just on the positive. But
there will be no negative. Don't worry. It's just like different degrees of positive.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Okay.
So I guess, like, you look at PayPal, and one of the best aspects of PayPal is its trust, right? Not only its trust, but its reach. PayPal reaches over 460 million consumers throughout the world. And, for us at MoonPay, one of the things that we always want to do is remove friction from the consumer experience. We want to be able to make it so easy that you could use your credit card or your debit card to be able to access the ecosystem, right? Or to be able to cash out of the ecosystem. The way that everything is sort of set up today, though, it's not always as easy as just because you use your credit card or your bank card, you can access into the ecosystem. There's so many different sort of fail safes that can occur. And with PayPal, what we were able to do is use their accounts to be able to access into this ecosystem, so that way it would reduce the amount of declines that we would ultimately have. And for them, in return, where they were only really offering access to 3 different cryptocurrencies, whether it was Bitcoin or Ethereum and others, we've now opened the sort of veil to over 100 different cryptocurrencies. And right now the partnership starts just in the United States, but ultimately it will roll out globally.
I know that a lot of times when people talk about cryptocurrency, one of the unfortunate topic that it often get associated with is fraud. People always say, well, crypto and fraud. But on the flip side, one would argue fraudsters and bad actors, they go where the money goes. So, in some ways it is inevitable. But curious to hear from you, your perspective on that, but also more importantly, what can MoonPay do and what can the industry do in general to make the ecosystem a little safer?
Okay. It's actually a very interesting question. And as I'd mentioned to you before, and I think that the listener should know this, that while now I understand that we'll only have varying degrees of positive questions, I had mentioned to Theo beforehand that I don't look at prep notes for any of these calls, because in any instance where if I don't know the answer to it, I either have to tell you I don't know the answer, or I could answer it for you on the spot, right? And as it relates to fraud, I think that there's a few different things that really matter. One is the perception that crypto is overridden with fraud is factually incorrect, right? The fact that it has fraud in it is correct, but the reality is that any instance where there's money involved, there will be fraud, right? That's number one. Number two, the idea that crypto is overrun with fraud is one of those things where, like there was the great New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, where he had this quote, and by the way, Democrat, where he said, You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. If you look at the percentage of fraud in the entire crypto ecosystem against Chainalysis over and over and over again, which looks at where money flows occur, the amount of fraud in crypto actually goes down. And the reason is it's actually a terrible sort of mechanism to conduct fraud. And the reason it's a terrible mechanism to conduct fraud is because it's not anonymous, right? It's semi-anonymous. And as these systems get more sophisticated and you could start to identify where people are flowing their money, like people who are committing bad behaviors will be discovered, right? And I think that that's a really important aspect, right? Like if I was watching Narcos a few weeks ago, right? And like if like the drug dealers in Narcos were alive today, they wouldn't be doing it with anything other than hardcore cash, because hardcore cash, even though it's a pain in the butt to move around, is 100% anonymous, right? Okay. That being said, I think that we have to look at the maturity of the crypto ecosystem. And if you're going to look at the maturity of the crypto ecosystem, you have to decide what is the method in which the crypto ecosystem can evolve out of a niche space and into the mass sort of market. As it relates to all technological revolutions. And so like you said, my background was Time and Bloomberg, but what you omitted was I started my career at Wired and Ars Technica, right? And so I'm very much, as technologically dorky as it gets, and I love sort of the idea of how do technologies start small and become mass. If you look at almost all technological revolutions, they usually start out with extraordinarily principled libertarian ideals that challenge the status quo, right? Like if you looked at the first issue of Wired in, I think it was April 1993, there is a sentence in the opening letter that says, technology is whipping through society like a Bengali typhoon while the media is asleep at the wheel, right? I could write that exact same sentence today on crypto. Today is just as exciting in my mind as 1993, and that's a whole nother topic. However, as technology moves from this very niche group of principled people to a larger mass adoption of individuals, certain concessions have to be made, right? And what people believe in their mind versus what people do in reality are two totally different things. So people could believe in the principles, but for this to really take off, it needs to concede on certain things. And so the things that will require it to concede on is this idea of full decentralization or full self-custody or full anonymity, right, down to the wallet address, will have to sort of give way for mass adoption to take place. That means that you'll have semi-decentralization, you'll have semi-self-custodial solutions. And as it relates to anonymity on the wallet, I think that for it to really sort of evolve with the global economic sort of system, which is where it looks like it's evolving to, you're going to have to require KYC into the ecosystem, KYC out of the ecosystem, and in some instances, KYC within the ecosystem when you're moving assets around. And what and by the way, for anyone who's listening, KYC is just know your customer, right? And for us, what we've taken very seriously over the past, year and a half that I've been at MoonPay, and even before, especially with Lindsay Haswell coming on as the chief legal officer, chief administrative officer, and Asif Herji joining, and others, is how do we make sure that we have all the proper licenses? How do we make sure that we're working with all the proper regulators? How do we make sure that we are KYCing everyone? And personally, I think that the ecosystem is going to, for a while, divide into two distinct groups that are going to be very similar to Apple, and Android, where Apple is very curated and very sort of defined, but you have your Apple ID, and that's how you enter in. And I think that's where MoonPay is going to play. And then there's going to be the more sort of rugged terrain that I think is still going to exist, where people are going to say, what, we don't want to be part of this larger ecosystem. We want our own freedoms. And that's totally fine too, but that's not where we are going to be sort of participating.
I love that analogy because it's something that I think it will resonate with people. It's something that we can relate to. I do want to ask you something else, because the other aspect when it comes to digital currency is the attitude towards it across different cultures and geographical regions. Now, we do see that, right? As many of us, we do traverse between different bubbles, if you will. And when it comes to how people think about digital currency, the future of money, or concepts such as Web3 and NFT, there are differences, right, between Asia, US, or even emerging hubs such as Dubai. I'm curious to hear from your perspective, because what you just said about Apple and Android, it is similar to, right? You see the adoption of Androids more towards the East and towards, groups of people, as you say, who wanted more freedom to explore and develop versus, we have groups of people who want a more, shall we say, curated ecosystem, if you will. So from your vantage point, why do you think that might be the case, in terms of attitudes towards digital currency and towards, technically speaking, going back to what you were saying with Wired and Arsenica, the attitude towards new technology and evolution. What do you think we're going to see in the next few years?
Sure. So it's a fascinating question. Um, Here, if I can step back and like zoom out for a second, I think I could give you a better answer than tactically. Um, you know, all new technologies, they come in very strong when in the beginning when they're going to be impactful. They then have like their sort of pullback period, and then they have their adoption period where the adoption takes place, and people don't really realize that the adoption is taking place because they're just improving the experience that the consumer has. And the reason that I start with that angle is when I was in media, people used to always ask me this question of, is print dead? Right? It's a really interesting question. Is print dead? And you're smiling on this, but like if I was to answer, this is what I would say to people all the time. I would say, I don't know if print is dead, but I do know that every day that someone is born on this planet and every day someone dies on this planet, a new print reader is not replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio with someone who dies, right? So what I do know is that it's a downward slope. However that slope is, whatever that angle is, I don't know. But I know that over time, that slope will ultimately get down to a small enough sort of segment. It may never hit zero in our lifetime, but it will just constantly decline. The flip side of that is when you get to something like cryptocurrencies or digital ownership or digital purchases. All I know is every day that someone is born and every day that someone dies, a new person who feels comfortable with the idea of purchases within the digital space or digital ownership is born at a rate that's higher than someone dies. Now, I don't want to make this a morbid conversation about life or death, right? But like, I think I love that you're laughing, and that for anyone who's not watching us on video, Theo's laughing right now at my terrible analogy of life and death and digital adoption. But the reason I bring this up is that I have, just like you have, a child who is 11 years old or 10 years old. She celebrated 10 and a half the other day. I don't celebrate half birthdays. She celebrates half birthdays. My wife celebrates half birthdays. I don't get half birthdays. But now that she's over 10 and a half, that I could round her up to 11. So we'll say that I have an 11-year-old daughter. And my 11-year-old daughter for the holidays asked for Robux. And that's an otherwise uninteresting request, except for the fact that my 11-year-old daughter for her holidays asked for a digital currency that could be used in her metaversal experience to unlock an experience that she can have with her friends. Now, nobody thinks like that. People think she has Robux to experience Roblox, but like what I'm saying is she has a digital currency to experience dimensionalized social media with her friends, and she's using that digital currency to unlock something that she perceives as valuable to her. She has not thought about it from that angle. She just says, I want Robux, that gives me this with my friends. Okay. But that's actually what's happening. And I think that as it relates to digital currencies in particular, one of the killer apps that are coming out of this evolution right now is stablecoins. And I think that we're seeing that with USDC and USDT and some of the other ones, right, that are actually backed by treasuries and have real world sort of assets backing them. And I think that one of the things that's going to be very interesting is a lot of times we talk about digital currencies and their values to first world nations, right, and that have otherwise stable currencies. But if you said to people that they can all of a sudden access a digital dollar very stably, digitally, in a country that's outside the US, I think that that's A, good for the US because treasury bills would be backing that digital dollar in the bank. So it strengthens the dollar against the popular perception that it does not. And B, it provides stability to areas of the world that just don't have stability. And so I think that east, west, north, south, like everyone's going to have different adoption sort of for how they do it, old, young. But at the end of the day, what the digitization of money will ultimately do is make a more efficient, more stable ecosystem globally.
I was laughing because there's so much that I think inside I was nodding. My daughter is also 11, and I also have a 14-year-old. And for the last 2 years, they've been asking for Robux for chores, for holidays, birthdays, New Year's. I still give them cash. This is like the very old-fashioned mommy, but I do give them Robux. And I also play Roblox with them. And we also trade. And one of the most common things that they complain about is, let's say, if my son were to gift me something, Roblox takes a cut out of it. And then he will complain, like, why is it that I give you X Robux? I gift this to you and you only get a portion of it. So there's a lot of parallels, I think, that we see being developed in the newer worlds and how it will evolve to something very different. And caveat, the reason why I play Roblox is so that I can actually be in there where the kids are, because that's all they spend their time in a virtual world, isn't it?
It's amazing. I was chatting with Commissioner Caroline Pham of the CFTC, and if you've not had her as a guest on your show, you should, because she is so utterly smart and brilliant as it relates to the evolution of this space. And she's very publicly discussed. And she too has, a daughter, I believe, around the same age, 11. And we were talking about this. She discussed sort of in her perspective, what's beginning to occur is if you think about money historically being defined as backed by governments, like you're now moving not only to having money backed by governments, but also sort of like a barter system of other means in which people are willing to exchange goods for goods for. And I do think that the thing that people find very challenging with this space is they think, oh my God, this is going to replace that. And I actually don't think that we're in a this is going to replace that type of phase. I think this is going to complement that, or this is going to coexist with that, is more realistic.
I cannot agree more. I'm just going to keep agreeing with you through the rest of the discussion, and I think we're on a good path.
We could disagree if you want. Do you want to choose a topic to disagree on?
That we will say for our face-to-face meeting.
Okay.
How's that?
Perfect.
But you did kill me inside a little bit when you were saying Prince is dead.
No, I didn't. I said it was dying. Here, can I give you? I'll give you an analogy as to why I'm saying it's not dead.
I'm still crying inside. Okay.
Okay. Right. So since we're stuck on weird analogies, like you could call this a discussion with Keith Grossman on weird analogies of everything. Let's pretend that print was horses. Okay. The
Okay.
animal horses. Okay.
Okay.
And I'm going to make this a really American analogy for a second. Okay. So I apologize to anyone who's outside the United States. In full disclosure, my degree was I was a government degree with a focus on American politics, history, and theory. So I am as weird as you get. But back in the 1700s, right, when the Oregon Trail was happening in America, what was mass transportation? It was horses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you remember this, like you studied this in history. Horses are what took people across the country. Okay, but then the trains were invented, and horses did not go extinct at all. Horses instead became localized transportation, right? And then cars were invented, and horses did not go extinct. Instead, they got relegated to two distinct areas of society: the affluent, right, who use them in the Hamptons and all these other, she places and ride them, and gamblers, right? And so I think that when you look at print and the history of print, by no means do I think in your lifetime or my lifetime it will be gone. I think that the role that it plays has evolved. Now, I love print. What you can't see over here is I have an entire bookshelf of physical books. I love reading more than anything else. It's the only hobby I have. I loved Time magazine when I was at Time. I loved Wired magazine. I loved Business Week, right? All of which, I was part of at one point or another in my career. But the roles that they played when they were founded versus the roles that they play today are two totally different things, right? Like Time's origin was to give you the relevant information you needed to know on a weekly basis, right? Today, if you step back, I think Time does a really nice job of identifying the individuals who are behind major shifts in impact on the world, right? And so the role of print is rather to seed the ongoing digital conversation with really important thought leadership. And I think that that's what brands like Time do. That's what brands like The Atlantic does. That's what like really important brands do is they see the ongoing consistent hum of the digital conversation, and they spark new conversations because they're able to act as a signpost in an otherwise chaotic world. Is that a fair way of pulling you out of your misery?
Thank you.
Okay.
I was just about to like go hide and cry because
No,
I
no,
am, but no,
here,
it makes sense. It makes sense.
but here's the thing, right? Like everyone thinks, and this was not going to be a conversation on media, but we should talk about it for 1 second because I think that the way people consume information is so interesting that people mistake it, which is everyone thinks that the world is either going to short form or video or whatnot. The reality is that consumers really look for three types of content, right? At the most basic level, they look to be informed, they look to get insights, or they look to be entertained, right? Like if you were really to dumb it down to three things. And then there's only three ways in which they can engage. They can either skim the content, which is what X is. They can dip into the content, which is 200 word, 300 word, 400 word piece, or they could dive into the content, which is like your books behind you, where you go really deep, right? And at any given moment, the consumer can play in any one of those 9 boxes, and every consumer plays in all 9 of those boxes. And some of them spend more time in one box than in the other. But like this thought that all consumers are moving to social media, or all consumers are moving to short form, is as ridiculous as going to a doctor that specializes in something and asking them what to do. And the doctor's always going to say what they specialize in.
You just reminded me of something that a lot of times people like to say when it comes to money. The whole world is all moving digital. Cash will be dead. Or everyone is going to go to tap to pay. Or I do think oftentimes we look at the world, we like to segment it in a very simple way. Perhaps that way, that's how our brain can digest information. But there are a myriad of different reasons that drive different uses at different times, the nuance is what we lose.
You're 100% correct. And when David Pogue left the New York Times to go over to Yahoo, David Pogue actually wrote an article in the New York Times. I'll never forget this. And I used to present this article all the time over and over and over again. It said, what did I learn from 10 years of covering tech? Right. And he said that things do not die, they splinter. Right. So picture this. He goes, video did not kill the radio star. Um, instant coffee did not kill regular coffee. All these things that you think, are extremes, like they're wonderful from the coverage perspective, but it's really evolution is a series of splintering, right? And then if you were to go to Kevin Kelly, who was one of the founders of Wired, right, and who I admire greatly as a thinker, he used to always say that the future is defined by optimists, right? And you're like, well, how can you say that? Everything in the world is so negative. And it's like, really zoom out for a second. Nobody tells the story of Keith woke up this morning, Keith made coffee, Keith sat down and had a lovely conversation with Theo that made her laugh, right? That made her cry at one point about France, that made her that had a great conversation, right? Got Sam all upset about the fact that he didn't prep for this call, right? Or this conversation. And then we went on with our day. Nobody tells that story. But if something drastic happened, then someone would tell that story, right? And so a lot of times you have to step back and zoom out. And if you look at the world, people are living longer, people are healthier. There's so many good things that happen, but the news constantly focuses in on to the negative, that you get this distorted reality as to where sort of things are. And things as extreme as this killed that always gets headlines more than, guess what? There's this slow evolution of this taking place, and it's probably going to happen over 15 years, and it's not super exciting, but it will make your life better.
I like what you just said. Step back and zoom out. I think oftentimes, perhaps you're right. We tend to dwell at things that catch our eyes, and that's the titles, the clickbaits, and that draws us into it. And of course, thank you to algorithms. Now we just find ourselves going through a loop and a doom cycle, if you will. So if we were to step back and zoom out and look at the last 2 decades, right, of the evolution of money, did anything surprise you at all about where we are today? I know some would say they're surprised banks didn't die yet.
No, I mean, so it's a really interesting question, because I've always, on the media side, I've always focused on the business and the technology and the strategy end of evolving. And then I come over to MoonPay, and it's still the same thing, the business and the strategy of the evolution. But now, instead of thinking about the consumer, I do think about sort of money in general. And the past year and a half, I have spent a lot of time looking at an industry that I have never really spent a lot of time looking at under the hood. And what's really interesting to me, and again, this is based on my sort of, I would say, my beginner's mind of coming into this industry and learning it, is a lot in the financial ecosystem. A lot of it has not changed, right? And there's an insane amount of inefficiency in it. Now, I want to caveat it with 1 second, which is, unlike media, where digitization can enter into the media ecosystem and disrupt it very quickly, I think it's really important that the evolution of any system that touches money is actually very slow. And the reason that you want it to be slow is because money's involved, right? And you want to make sure that it is regulated properly. You want to make sure that it's transparent. You want to make sure that the systems work. You want to make sure that, like the transition is smooth, right? Like there's a huge difference between messing up the banking system globally or evolving media, right? That being said, as this change takes place, and I think that the most important aspect, and this goes to sort of what we were chatting before, um, where I posted that it's upsetting to me that cryptocurrencies have become politicized this year. This shouldn't be politicized, right? Like this should be understood. Um, but that being said, I think that we have to look at tokenization and think to ourselves that the second that clear regulation takes place globally, or even in America, tokenization has the potential to be just as disruptive to the financial ecosystem as digitization was to the media ecosystem. And I think that what's going to require first is proper and clear regulation and policy, and the adoption is definitively going to take place in my mind.
You sound like me this morning talking to a group of people about using AI in financial services. That's literally what I said is we need to move slow, and it's okay to be slow because it is an industry that requires trust. It is a foundation of the economy. If you end up creating scenarios where people don't trust the system, where we, somehow mess up how money is moved from one entity to the other, the repercussions of it is much more serious than, let's say, given a wrong recommendation on a book.
So here's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And I was observing our CEO and co-founder Ivan Soto Wright on a stage at Milken the other day talking about the future of money, and it was an amazing conversation. And on the stage was Christopher Giancarlo, right, who has had a history within the government, within these departments, and is currently over at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, right, as a senior counsel. And he said something to me that I had never, or he said on stage, but because I was so engrossed in the conversation, I thought it was to me. How's that, right? But he said something that I was so taken aback by, where he said, if you look at the different systems of regulation throughout the world, he said European systems tend to step forward and say, hold on, no innovation. We are going to define everything, and then we're going to tell you the rules that you have to operate by. Whereas America, as a system of regulation, tends to say, okay, go out, be innovative, and sort of get into the sandbox, and then we will sort of regulate according to how your innovations go and how we see the sort of ecosystem fitting. That there are benefits to both systems, right? In the European system or the European approach, you have a way of thinking about it where people, don't sort of color outside the lines, but like they don't get to evolve as fast. In the American system, you're always playing catch up. The regulators will always be playing catch up to the entrepreneurs and the innovators, which presents its own problems, but also its benefits in terms of constantly evolving as a country. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of mental model of the world today as it relates to regulation, and how ultimately innovation will push these industries forward.
I agree. I think, although I would add, though, the challenges as the ecosystems are more interconnected than ever, right? You can't, it's getting really, really hard to define things in the old ways by physical border. You can't do that anymore. So I am struggling quite a bit lately in looking at how different the regulations are, especially when it involves technology, and what can be used and what cannot be used in Europe versus here. Because we do move, right? Companies do cross borders. It's digital.
Well,
Digital
how about this?
has no borders.
Here's what you just said is so true. And when I was chatting with another colleague the other day, Sam Ewan over at CoinDesk, and he said to me, have you ever considered that the internet is its own country? And he went through a whole entire sort of global sort of economic system where as it moves in and out of different regions of the world, it's still one country and it still needs to sort of figure out how to work within it. But the analogy, as I went home after we were chatting and I thought about it, is very true and is very interesting, right? Um, like the internet has evolved, and in every instance, it's reduced the costs of doing good, of doing services down to almost zero, right? Like, think about like when you and I were growing up, right? Like the AT&T commercials, that was like $2.49 to call Japan, or like $8 to call India, right? And like that was an ad on TV. That was like, it was this expensive. And now today, like, I don't know, like I use WhatsApp to make a phone call, or like I never think about how much it costs per minute to call Dubai or any other place in the world, right? Because voice over IP has essentially brought the cost down to zero. The cost of moving money today is still very expensive, right? As you said, and slow. And so if the internet can all of a sudden bring that cost down to almost zero and instantaneously, I think that you have it's a hard sell to say to somebody, no, you should pay high fees and you should wait.
I still do. I know it is hard. Before we wrap, though, there are two things I do want to make sure we touch on. One is I did not know until you told me. I don't know why I missed it, but last time when we talked, you brought up a special moment about the immersive exhibit that recreated, I would say, the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was one of the most iconic moments in American history. I ended up going to the site and looked for it. I have no idea how I missed it, but I did. What else would you say is your most memorable moment looking back at your careers that, spend the past 2+ decades?
Oh,
Picking favorites.
um, it's an interesting question. So I have I'm very good prospectively, and I'm terrible retrospectively, if this makes sense. So, um, can I give like a few that I
Yeah.
think like, but like in total, they've only like, I have to highlight that in by no means was I the only person involved in them. Like I was part of the teams that did these things, and really sort of honored and special to do this with my colleagues, especially when it comes to Wired. It was a lot of times with Maya Drazen and Howard Mittman and Jay Loff and Drew Shuda, and ours technically was Robbie Sauerberg and Bloomberg, and I with Paul Kane and others, and Scott Havens, who's now at the Mets, and others. So okay, so at Wired, I think that the two things I was most proud of were digitizing the brand, right? Being the first brand at Condé Nast to exceed 50% of its revenue in digital. And that was a big move at the time. Everyone thought that we were crazy because the CPM in print was so much higher, but like we knew that the consumer trend was moving towards digitization. That's something that I think, like when I was describing it the other day to my daughter, she thought it was the stupidest accomplishment ever, but at the time, it was really important. When I was at Condé, the moment that I really was so utterly proud of was the tablet edition. When we launched the Wired tablet edition, that Steve Jobs held up and said, "This is the way that a brand should think about the tablet." And it was much different than how Condé Nast was thinking about it. Condé Nast was thinking about it as a magazine, two pieces of paper on a new device with a seam down the middle. And we said, no, every screen was unique, right? And GQ and Vanity Fair actually launched before Wired. They launched on April 3rd, 2010, and Wired launched, I think it was March 25th, 2010. And in 24 hours, we did over 24,000 downloads, right? It was amazing. And that led to me becoming the associate publisher of Wired. Um, I think one of my other highlights at Wired was, you know, when the editors came and asked if they could get a check to mine Bitcoin in their offices, and I wrote that check, and that was what brought me into the crypto ecosystem, and I really loved that. With Ars Technica, I think one of the proudest moments at Ars was the Ars Accelerator, which was the predictive algorithm that we figured out how to identify if an article would go viral on Ars. And you know, huge kudos to Ken Fisher, the editor in chief, and Robbie Sauerberg and others who like thought this was a crazy idea when I presented it, but like they figured out a way to do it, and we rolled it out and grew ours 85%, you know, year over year, and turned it into the fifth largest brand at Conde. And for that and for the tablet, we won a Project Isaac Award for advertising invention. At Bloomberg, I think what's important to me was a few things. When I went to Bloomberg in 2014, people said to me, why would you go there? That's not a media company. And I think that to their credit, you know, Paul Kane was an amazing, probably one of the best people to come into my life personally and professionally. David Carey too. But, you know, Justin Smith, who's now over at Semaphore, you know, was the CEO. And, you know, he helped really spearhead change there. And I was honored to be part of that team and to turn Bloomberg into what it is today. And I think my highlight there was A, getting it recognized as a real media company, but then B, launching QuickTake, which was the social mobile video, right, that it has. And then at Time, you know, like getting people to realize that Time can be modernized, right? And I thought, and I loved, you know, working for Mark and Lynn Benioff. I loved working with Edward Felsenthal and, you know, Sam Jacobs, the new editor in chief, and the team there. And, you know, this one person, Maya Drazen, who I mentioned at Wired, you know, was also the chief brand officer when I was over at Time. And she's one of the best people in my life, you know, also personally, professionally, and everything I feel like great that I've ever done, I've done with Maya. And so, you know, now being at MoonPay, I love this team. I love the vision of, you know, democratizing digital ownership and access to digital ownership. And I love, you know, seeing people's minds change, you know, and seeing what's possible, you know, and I think that that's what this now allows me to do is on this platform.
Seeing what's possible certainly is something that I believe we need to make sure that we remember, right, as we look towards the future. So before we wrap up, if you were to give an advice to the next generation when it comes to career choices, seeing what's possible, what would that be? Because I'm super curious. This is something that is a constant conversation we've been having with the kids. Tech is playing such a dominant role in our society. And thinking back to what you were saying and how you help transform the different brands towards the future, what would you tell the kids that they should be doing or studying? And how would they know when the time is right for them to pivot to something else?
So this is a great question. But I will say this is I actually gave this advice already because I was the commencement speaker at Riverdale Country School, where I went to school and where my daughter goes, last year. And on LinkedIn, you can see that I posted I posted my speech and I removed the thank yous to the teachers in it from it because I didn't think it was necessary for people outside. But it was how to navigate change and uncertainty, right? And when I wrote the speech, I went into ChatGPT. This is the first commencement speech I ever did. And I said to ChatGPT, I said, how should I write a commencement speech? And I wrote it in conjunction with ChatGPT, right? And I acknowledged that throughout the commencement speech. So you could see how a speech could be written in partnership with the technology at the same time. The thing that I tried to instill on everyone is that you might think that this time is different, and this time is different, but it is not different, right? We've gone through major upheavals before. If you actually look at, you know, the years 1879 to 1904, right? Between 1879 and 1904, the light bulb, the airplane, the telephone, and the automobile were all invented. Okay, so picture what that meant. If you died, this is like very morbid, by the way, Theo. Like we've talked a lot about life and death today, right? But if you died in 1878, you left a world that did not know the light bulb, that did not know an airplane, that did not know an automobile, and that did not know a telephone. And if you were born in 1904, you only knew a world that knew airplanes, telephones, light bulbs, and automobiles. Now, in 1910, there was definitely somebody who was like, I don't need a car, I'll stick with my horse. Okay, you know it, I know it. There was some person that was like, I don't need a car, I will stick with my horse, right? That's the phase that we're in right now, which is the advent of blockchain, of AI, of ML, of metaverses, the speed at which computing can take place, and space travel, everything. Like this is why I think this is such an exciting moment in time. Is going to open up a world that is so different in the same way that those four technologies between 1879 and 1904 changed the course of the world. Now, if you want to evolve, right, like Asif Hirji, the president of MoonPay, former COO of Coinbase, always says, and I think it's the best advice, go to the edges, right? That is the most exciting area to evolve, right? Like if you want to be in the future of finance, play in crypto and fintech. If you want to be in the future of, travel, go to a SpaceX, right? If you want to be in the future of automobiles, like go to a Tesla, right? Like don't fall in love with the past. Don't romanticize the past. Like the past can teach you so much, right? But like the people who hold on to the past have an albatross on them from evolving into the future. The other thing I would simply say is Winston Churchill has this great quote of, I've never gotten indigestion from eating my own words. And I think that it's really important that as you evolve, you start to learn things that about yourself. And I know that when I graduated from college, everything in my life was so black and white. Everything was so strongly opinionated. And then as I got older in life, my opinions hardened in certain areas, but I realized that things were more gray than I thought they were. And I think that it's really important to realize that life is not black or white. Life is gray. It's nebulous, right? Life is not rational. The biggest companies on the planet, they're all Lipitor ads, right? They all look good on the outside, but they all have problems on the inside. Amazon, the biggest company on the planet, if it was perfect, it wouldn't have layoffs because it would always be calibrating itself to the perfect amount of people that it has to do the job at hand. And so like, I think that if you could navigate the world realizing that type of flexibility, you're well suited to be successful in life, as long as you're flexible and open-minded and you recognize how technologies do impact industries.
The first season of the podcast I ran was called Shades of Grey.
Oh, really? So then there you go.
Yeah, so I definitely appreciate gray. Not everything is black and white, but I did write down, don't fall in love with the past and go to the edges. And that's, I believe, is where we'll find Keith, if anyone is curious and interested. But this has been a fascinating conversation about life, death, and possibilities. I don't think I've ever done a show like this. This is amazing, fascinating, and like I said in the very beginning, we are in for a treat, and a treat it was. So thank you so much for your time today, Keith. It's been a pleasure every time we chat. So I look forward to actually meeting you in person one day.
I very much look forward to it as well. And thank you so much for inviting me onto your show. I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much. And for the rest of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of One Vision. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we'll talk to you all next week.